listening to Talking Points with Preferred Health Magazine. On this amazing show, you get a VIP look at interviews with some of today's beloved celebrities, book authors, top physicians, and leaders in the healthcare industry. So stick around, you're not going to want to miss what's next. Hi, and thanks for tuning into Talking Points with Preferred Health Magazine. My guest today is Dr. Bruce Perry, who has teamed up with Oprah Winfrey to co-write a best-selling book titled What Happened to You? A question I'm sure derived from Dr. Perry's many years of research in childhood trauma, both as a neuroscientist and psychiatrist. In the book, Oprah and Dr. Perry share their journey and experiences with childhood trauma. Dr. Perry, however, lends his expertise to not only decipher emotions, but to clinically explain how the brain changes and adapts as a result of trauma. He's also featured on the cover of Preferred Health Magazine. So let's welcome him to the show today. Hello, Dr. Bruce Perry. Welcome to Talking Points with Preferred Health Magazine.
Hi, Angela. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a great honor to speak with you today.
Well, believe me, the honor is mine.
So, wow, listen, your book, What Happened to You, really, I say, puts into perspective the whole nature versus nurture debate, right? So you speak, about instances that take place as early as in utero and how that affects our brain's development. You co-wrote this book, though, alongside one of today's megastars, Oprah Winfrey. Now, she's always been very adamant about speaking about the traumatic events of her childhood. She's an advocate for child abuse. So first, can you tell me a little bit about how you and Oprah began this collaboration? Sure. And how you came up with the name for the book?
Well, first of all, I met Oprah about 30 years ago, actually more than 30 years ago, when we both were in Chicago. And it's a long story, but she became aware of the work I was doing and invited me to meet with her and some other people in her small inner circle to really address some of the problems about abuse, child abuse. And she really wanted to try to create energy and to change policy and practice that would minimize child abuse. And of course, this was a very personal thing for her. And as you know, as she became more and more famous, she had more and more influence. And as she's always has, she wanted to use that influence to try to help other people. So she pulled me into that circle a little bit, and I got to know her. And we've been having conversations about this for the last 30 years.
And how did the name come to be? I mean, was that something you came up with? Was something that you collaborated on, or? Well,
the phrase "What happened to you" actually has its origins in a group meeting. There's a pioneer in our field. Her name's Dr. Sandra Bloom, and she had a clinical team, and they were sitting around talking about a client. And they had been shifting the way they were doing work to become increasingly focused on the developmental history and the impact of trauma on the patient's current functioning. And so somebody in her group, Joe Foderero, basically said, it's almost as if we've changed the major question of our work from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And that simple reframing of how you try to understand somebody, I think captures one of the really most important parts of our work and of all of the work that people are doing in developmental trauma. And so now the interesting thing about this is, I'd been talking to Oprah about this stuff for 30 years. And in part, this speaks to what a terrible teacher I must be, that finally,
right.
Finally, a couple of years ago, when we were doing a 60 Minutes piece about child abuse, she heard me make that comment. She's like, I get it. And I'm like, after 30 years, now you're getting it? Anyway.
But because the questions, instead of saying what's wrong with you, you ask what happened to you, it kind of opens up the conversation, we would say, in that non-threatening, non-defensive way. There's
Exactly.
no negative connotation in that question, where as opposed you ask it the other way and right away you feel that you need to be defensive for whatever the reason might be. It's just the way,
Absolutely.
it's kind of what, like how they say, it's not what you say, but how you say it. Right.
Exactly. And the nice thing about it is it's sort of a curiosity. Like, I want to get to know you. Like,
Yes.
what's going on with you? Like, where did that come from? As opposed to what you're doing is wrong and bad and you're stupid or
Right.
whatever it
Right.
is.
Right. It
Mhm.
just has that connotation to it. Now,
Yeah.
early, you say in the book, your early life experiences, even in the womb,
Yeah.
can help shape our future selves. And I think
Yeah.
most people can really grasp that concept, both good and bad. But how does that childhood trauma affect the brain development? And that's really where I see you coming in to the book as
Yeah.
explaining that.
Yeah. Well, everybody who's been around children and babies, we all know that the development is this amazingly rapid process. Over the course of 1 year, for example, a newborn goes from this little cute thing to someone who can walk and say words, beginning words, and then in a couple more years, they're like really more and more and more changes. And so we all appreciate this rapid developmental process that takes place. What we don't all appreciate as well is that in the brain, there are these really important systems that are involved in thinking, feeling, moving, behaving, and actually involved in regulating other parts of our body. And that these systems are exquisitely sensitive to the pattern and nature of developmental experiences. And so you can take a child at birth, and if they have attentive, attuned, loving, verbal, warm interactions, all kinds of things happen in the brain that are different than if that child was basically in an environment where there was a single overwhelmed caregiver, where there was inconsistency in when they had meals and how much food they had and where they slept, and if they were exposed to noise, or if they were, think about these kids, for example, that are
Yeah.
sitting around the airport at Kabul.
Right.
Those external experiences influence the developing brain and make those systems that are involved in thinking, feeling, behaving, and in our physical health change. So the one child who had all these wonderful things happen will, in many ways, express his or her their developmental potential.
Right.
And the other child is going to have a whole bunch of adaptations to these traumatic experiences that really will ultimately wear out the end organs, your heart, your lung, your gut, and make you more vulnerable to physical health problems, but also will remain systems that are involved in thinking, feeling, and behaving will become undeveloped or abnormally organized. And so they'll be more likely to have trouble with school and trouble with relationships
Concentrating, things of
and
that.
concentrate. Exactly. And so the reality of the impact of early experiences is something that I think we all appreciate, but sometimes we don't appreciate in the depth that I think would be helpful for everybody.
I think you're right in that. I think also it's not until much later when we are having all these symptoms of that trauma that we then realize, we have to step back and go back to where the trauma began to
Yeah.
even solve the issues. You speak about stress response systems and how we first, feel first, and we're like, when you speak about the brain and up to the cortex, how we're reacting almost first, or maybe that's just a human instinct, until we then, are able to rationalize the stimuli or whatever's happening. So can you tell us just more like what happens exactly? What is happening in the brain initially?
Yeah. So first of all, our brain's this incredible complex set of systems. And there's billions and billions of moving parts and cells and important proteins and all kinds of things going on. Complex beyond anything any given person can comprehend. And now, but amongst all that complexity, there's a really simple elegance to the way your brain processes the present moment. And so we have these senses, what we see, hear, smell, taste, that comes into our brain, and it comes into the lower parts of our brain first, and it's processed at a primitive level, so to speak. And then it goes up into higher parts of our brain that are more what we think of as the most human part of our brain, the cortex, where we think, where we sort of plan and all that kinds of stuff. So the simple organization you were talking about earlier, Angela, that literally human beings are organized to behave, to act before we think, and which can get you in trouble, right? And,
absolutely.
The reason we have all these sayings about look before you leap, measure twice, cut once,
Right.
all of that is because human behavior is so characterized by this reactive, interactive quality.
Right.
And now the good thing about the top part of our brain is that as you get older, your cortex gets stronger, it gets more organized, and it has the ability to basically feedback and kind of regulate that lower part of your brain that's more impulsive.
Okay.
So the 1-year-old child that's hungry has the exact same feeling that you do when you're hungry.
Right.
But when you're hungry, your cortex, it can tell time, and it can say, you know what, I'm going to be able to be off and grab lunch in an hour.
Right.
And so you can kind of contain that feeling of discomfort and live with it. But the toddler's like, whoa, it doesn't matter. I need now. I want to eat now. And so we can't say, oh, lunch is in an hour.
Right. And you say that too. You mentioned how there's no, I think it was when you spoke about linear memory, there's no real concept of time for somebody who is having a response to trauma.
Yeah, well, exactly. So those lower parts of our brain, where our stress response systems originate, those systems don't have the ability to tell time like the top part of our brain, the cortex, the smart part of our brain. And so when information comes in that is reminiscent of what happened to us in the past, so a combat veteran from Vietnam walking down the street, here's a car backfire, that goes into the lower part of the brain first, and that will activate a whole set of responses before the information even gets to the cortex.
Right.
So he will literally act and react before he understands what's happening.
So you have that physical response before you get to rationalize.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And now for people interested in healthcare, this is really important because you can be in an environment where you're surrounded by cues that are continually activating and turning on these little mini stress reactions that are flogging your heart and your lung and your gut. And so you're going to have hypertension, you're going to have cardiac issues, you're going to have a higher probability of diabetes, you're going to have a higher probability of GI problems. And so when you go into a regular healthcare clinic, you see that many of the presenting problems are complicated by histories of trauma, if not actually caused by histories of trauma.
Right. I mean, it's funny, but you go to your family practitioner, it's almost as if one of the first questions they should ask is, they ask about the family history medically, but they really should be focusing on our past traumas and our past mental health issues and things of that nature. Then.
Absolutely. Angela, that's such an important point. And one of the things that's happening is that more and more primary care physicians and other healthcare providers are recognizing the relationship between these what seem like disconnected phenomenon and your current functioning. This is really important for indigenous people, for example, or any other group that has been marginalized and impacted by transgenerational trauma. Refugee groups, indigenous communities all around, in First Nations in Canada, Native Americans in the US, because this transgenerational impact, their history of stress, trauma, distress is impacting their physical health.
And the thing is, it's like that, I believe also, and tell me if I'm wrong, because of their environment. It's because of either stories passed down, the stresses are inherited in some way, not physiologically,
Absolutely.
or maybe physiologically also, you tell me, or is it just more of about the nurture part of it?
Well, it's both actually. One of the things there's a field, and I'm sure you've heard of it, called epigenetics, where people are studying the ability or the impact of experiences in one generation, which are stressful, distressing, traumatic.
Right.
That will literally change the way your chromosomes turn on and turn off certain genes. And so you can pass that to the next generation.
Sure.
Even though that baby will never experience the trauma that the grandparents experienced,
Right.
there have been genetic changes or changes to the way that the genes are regulated that can impact their physiology. This is one reason when you're really studying, increased rates of diabetes in First Nations or in African American populations, for example, you have to understand the impact of transgenerational trauma, as well as the impact of that individual's own history of experience.
Right, right. I mean, it's terrible to say that. It's almost like a double whammy. It's like, you come into something unbeknownst to you, and you're suffering from it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
the irony is that these molecular adaptations help that generation survive, that helped them stay alive. It was part of their resilience. But something that was once adaptive can ultimately become maladaptive. So let me give you a very simple example. If a child grows up in an environment where there's a lot of chaos, and let's say there's a domestic violence situation, their brain will help them develop a form of hypervigilance. They'll literally be able to study a social situation and figure out really quickly, safe or not safe.
I know a couple of people like this.
Absolutely. And we all do. I mean, because it's a very common phenomenon, right? So in that situation, as a young child, being able to figure out, is this going to be a night where I'm going to get some sleep, or do I need to go, what do I need to do to kind of get through the night?
Right.
That hypervigilance is adaptive. But the next day when he goes to school and he's supposed to be paying attention to the math lesson, then he hears a noise in the hallway and he focuses on that. By the time he comes back to engage on the math lesson, he's lost. And so it's maladaptive in the classroom. And this is what happens to so many folks, is they get misdiagnosed and misunderstood and then marginalized, and I could go on, but because we haven't appreciated the impact of developmental trauma on children and adults, we've made a lot of false assumptions about how to treat them and help them. And sometimes our good intentions are actually making the problems worse.
Right. Where people now are suffering so much from, you hear depression, anxiety, addictive behaviors, where even some people with conditions that you wouldn't think were malproductive, because they're people pleasers, like Oprah mentions in the book. Like, she became a people pleaser. She's highly successful. You don't look at Oprah, if you didn't know her history, and say to yourself, yeah, she's a very successful woman. She must have had this great upbringing that lifted her and encouraged her and nurtured her there. But it was just the opposite. So as far as mental health conditions go, it really is still peeling back the layers, that I guess helps us, understand it better.
So one of the most important things in this healing and recovery process is having a person or persons who are able to basically provide this relationally safe place for you to kind of make your mistakes and get nurturing and get some regulation and have somebody who is going to help you despite your developmental problems or despite your impulsivity. And then what'll happen is as they stay with you, as they continue to be engaged with you, your mistakes become less frequent and less intense, and you grow you grow up, you mature. That's what normal development is, right? So if you think
Right.
about a 2-year-old who's in a household with loving adults, those 2-year-olds make a lot of mistakes. The very nature of growing up is making mistakes. It's like trying to pour your own milk and pouring the cup
Yeah.
goes everywhere. And the next time, even though you're told, let me help you pour the milk, they want to pour their milk, they'll pour, but they won't make as big a mess. And it's literally the fact that you're still there, you're still patient, you're still redirecting, you're still loving them, means that they can make big mistake and then medium mistake and then little mistake and then no mistake and then mastery. And that's development. And so if you don't have those people in your life who can help you in these sort of recovery processes with regards to focus, relationships, other forms of kind of human interaction where you've sort of messed up, you don't get better. And then of course you end up diverging further and further away from the developmental trajectory. And you could be a 25-year-old person who has the social skills of a 4-year-old. And we all know people like that too, right?
We know people like that too. Now you do talk about how timing of the trauma when it happens in your life is important, and that in fact the earlier it happened to you, the more likely that as an adult, even though you may have come past it, you're living a healthy life, that a trigger can send you right back more so than somebody who had trauma at a later age.
Right. And
So how do you explain
Angelina, that kind of has to do with the development of the brain. The brain develops sequentially from the bottom parts up to the top. So the last part of our brain, the most remarkable part of our brain, where we think and plan and creative stuff, all that is in our cortex.
Right.
That doesn't finish developing until you're about 28, 29, 30.
Okay. I thought 25, but yes. Okay.
Yeah,
So even later.
You're older. Yeah, you're older. And so, but the lower parts of the brain that contain these really important regulatory networks involved in stress and a lot of other important functions, they develop really early in life. They start in utero, and then in the first months of life, they get shaped very significantly by the nature and the timing of your relational interactions.
Mhm.
So if you have a loving, attentive adults in your life when you're young, those systems kind of get a good jump start
Right.
on developing normally. And then they play a really important role in helping the rest of the brain grow up. So
do they become your kind of go-to safety net when you're then dealing with those traumas later on in life? Is that
exactly, that's exactly right. So if you have that good head start and those systems are pretty well regulated, it's a little bit like weightlifting, right? So those systems are strong. They've had training. They've had this intensive training that allows them to work really well later on. But if the first couple of months when they're supposed to be organizing don't go well, these systems develop. They're very basically disorganized and they're weak.
Right.
And so when you run into stressors or challenges later on, you're not capable of managing that. And then those experiences are magnified. So the impact of those experiences are magnified because you don't have the buffering capability that would have been built in by positive early experiences.
Now, what do you say about trauma, though, that does happen later on in life? And like, for example, like we spoke about the soldier coming home from war who suffers PTSD. I personally have a PTSD trauma of my own that happened after the death of my mother, and this was 12 years ago.
Yeah.
I can't drive over bridges because I associate driving over that bridge as when I was visiting her in the hospital. So I have this problem now. And what do you say about that? Because if the brain is, I had pretty much fairly good upbringing, but still I just cannot get over that bridge.
Right.
So is your brain always developing these new responses in a sense?
Well, your brain is always capable of developing these new responses, and that's one of the miracles of our brain. I mean, it's amazing because it remains adaptive, it remains changeable, even if you're as old as I am. You know, I'm an old goat. Look at me. I mean,
You look good. You look good. You got all your hair still.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But I can still change. You know, I can still. I'm trying to learn Spanish. You know, I can change.
But for the better and for the worse,
And
though,
for the
is what I'm
worse.
saying.
So the thing, Angela, about having a traumatic experience when you're older, there's no doubt that it can be painful, it can be disruptive, you can have all kinds of things, but it's easier to change back. It's easier to treat therapeutically.
Okay.
If you have the same kind of really significant trauma when you're very young, it impacts development in ways that are very complex and complicated, because remember, the brain is developing.
Right.
And so a traumatic experience on the developed brain has consequences that are bad but treatable.
Okay.
And trauma on the developing brain has more significant consequences that are treatable, but you have to have a much more sophisticated, developmentally focused treatment plan. So like,
right.
If you have a thing about bridges, then you could probably go through a progressive process of facing that in a dosed way. Right. And learning how to tolerate it just a little, just drive up to a bridge and just look at it and then go back. And then, there's a lot of things that you could do if you wanted to drive over bridges. There's a lot of times I just tell people, that's it. Hey, avoid bridges.
Oh, yeah. It's been a nightmare.
Don't live on Manhattan.
Is that right? Exactly. Don't live in the city. Well, you know what? What I want to know is, though, like, how do we begin to heal from the early childhood trauma? I mean, how do you train your brain, as we're talking about right now, to associate those triggers with something else, maybe?
Yeah, the key is, and again, kind of getting back to the importance of relationships, is that if you have people in your life who are present with you in a real multi experiential way, and I mean not just sitting there 1 hour a week as a therapist, but people who you can have lunch with and have a conversation with, and sometimes go to a movie with, just people who are around you all the time. If you've got a density of people, part of what happens is your brain kind of wants to heal. It wants to have reparative experiences. It wants to continue to grow and organize. And so if you have this relational environment where you can have these tiny little doses of success in getting better at a social thing and getting a little bit of reassurance when you feel anxious, or somebody who recognizes that you're feeling down and reaches out to you. All of these tiny little doses of positive human interactions are probably the best way to work through and grow through developmental trauma. Now, it does help to have kind of a clinician who knows how to guide you through that process.
Right.
But even if you have a really good therapist and you live in a relational vacuum, you're not going to get better.
Right. Because ultimately you're saying is community is ultimately what's important.
Right. The community is the environment that's providing these opportunities for
change,
the kinds of therapeutic interactions that allow you to heal and to grow. And again, every study that looks at this ends up sort of converging on the importance of safe and stable relationships.
I agree with that 100%, especially in the wake of 2020, where we saw so many people having to isolate themselves and families isolating themselves, and the suicide and drug abuse and things like that. Yeah. Kind of coming to the forefront yet again for some people, maybe who are in recovery, for instance, or not, or dealing with therapy and now having to not go to their therapist session because they were isolating themselves. So what do you kind of say to that and what's happening maybe yet again?
Yeah, one of the things that I think everybody has experienced this in the last 18 months,
Yeah.
the the shift in your energy level, kind of the everybody's had, there's been some impact from this experience. But those of us that are in the mental health field and education, I just got off the phone with a bunch of my colleagues addressing this, and we're seeing, 100% more behavioral problems in classroom environments than we did 2 years ago. We're seeing many, many more reports of anxiety and depression. We're seeing more and more people, as you pointed out, who are struggling with substances. And I think it really speaks to the fact that human beings are very relational creatures. And at our core, there's reward systems in our brain and the systems that keep our stress response regulated. Those are very relationally dependent. So when we're in community, when we feel like we're with our people and like we belong, we laugh, and we feel connected. We feel a sense of meaning and purpose. But the more we drift away from our people, and the more we don't feel like we belong, the more isolated and the more vulnerable we become. And I think this is something that's really an underappreciated aspect of mental health. We really don't appreciate how important it is for us to belong.
Connected. I think it's almost a human, makeup. It's part of our makeup, I feel like, to not be alone.
Well, I agree completely. Absolutely. I wrote a book earlier called Born for Love, and it's all about the importance of human connection and empathy and love, and why that's such an essential element of the human physiology. Human beings, the lowest divisible unit of our species isn't the person, it's the clan, it's the group. We survived in the natural world because we were able to create these effective groups that could hunt and gather and protect each other. And that's how we survived. And I think that the modern world has sort of granulated us, right? We have our own room, and we have our own TV in our own room. And I think that social media, for example, is something where a lot of us feel this hunger to be connected, but we have this sort of junk food connection through social media.
Right. I feel like it's a blessing and a curse.
Exactly. And I think it can be used in a positive way. But I also think for a lot of people, it's kind of like it's empty. It's, there's this, they want to get filled up, and if you get 10,000 friends, it doesn't really fill you up. 10,000 likes or whatever.
Right. It becomes not as significant.
Yeah. But again, we can use it for communication, for all kinds of other important things. But if you rely on it for your real relational connection, it's not going to meet your needs.
So I want to kind of go back just a little bit, if we can. I know you spoke about, that there is a way to overcome the traumas, and that's, again, through community and relationships and healthy relationships. But you also mentioned where, just like a great basketball player, there's something to be said about just repetitive experiences. So tell me, what are some of the ways besides community that we can move forward with that trauma?
One of the first things I think that people who have experienced trauma can benefit from is recognizing that sort of the bedrock capability of being successful and healing is regulation. And one of the most powerful things we have that helps us regulate is rhythm. And so and most people probably have
a routine. Are you saying like a routine?
Well, a routine is important, external structure, but within that routine, if you're doing something that's rhythmic, music, walking, running, needlework. So pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity actually goes into those core regulatory systems I talked about in the lower part of the brain, and it quiets them down. And so you can get that through breathing, just sort of meditative activities. But just honestly, I think the easiest one is to walk. Walking is an incredibly regulating thing.
Okay.
So
being in touch with nature or yourself.
that's part of it. That, it's if you can walk in a beautiful, it's like green space, sort of bathe yourself in the trees and the wind and the sounds of a creek, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
There's research that shows that that's helpful for your brain. And so that's a start.
Right.
And regulation. Now, the reason that's important is that if you can sort of quiet down this lower part of your brain, which is very frequently overactive if you have had trauma, then it makes it easier for you to connect with people. And
Right.
it's in the connection that all the magic happens, where you feel rewarded, and then you get another dose of regulation. Because when you feel like you're with your people, it's like,
yeah, you could be you, or
I'm
for
me,
instance,
I'm
yes.
safe.
Mhm.
Yeah, you get me, right?
Right.
And you go out in the world, you have to be somebody else. You have to be kind of what you think the world wants you to be. But then you get with your people and you can like,
Right.
so you're safe and you can be regulated. And that's where a lot of healing can happen, in those relational interactions. And then you get to the top part of your brain, which is very powerful, but human beings are very, very sensitive. That part of your brain is very, very elusive. And what I mean by that is, when you're very busy and you're preoccupied and you go from appointment to appointment to appointment and you're kind of feeling under stress, what happens is that top part of your brain just kind of shuts down and gets less efficient. So once you're regulated and you've got some sense of relational safety, then you've got this opening up of this part of your brain that's the most creative part of your brain. And so we use this our mantra is that the sequence of engagement for teaching, for communication, for healing, for parenting, for coaching, is to regulate, relate, and then reason. And a lot of times you'll see somebody, one of your friends will come in and they'll be dysregulated from work or a relationship. And our tendency is to try to use words to say, oh, you didn't like him anyway, or he was a piece of crap.
Right. We think we're comforting.
Yeah, but we're not. We need to, what we should do is say, let's walk, let's take a walk. Let's walk with me. Let's go down and get something. Let's go get some coffee. And as you walk, it's regulating. And then you sit down and then you're connecting. And then they'll be able to hear you say, I'm not sure you really wanted to be with him anyway.
Right.
But if they come in when they're dysregulated and you go, he was a loser. You shouldn't be upset. That doesn't work, right?
I feel like I've definitely had this conversation before.
And I think we all have.
But yeah, so I get it. So what you're saying is, kind of like disengage from the problem for a minute.
Regulate.
To then regulate the emotion, bring it down, and then, discuss and have that, reconnect.
And then you can reason with people.
And then reason and decipher it out. Yeah. I love this. I mean, this topic is something I can probably go on all day about. It is something that's so needed, and in everybody's life, whether you had the great life or the traumatized life, I think it's something that is so important to really understand, just so that we can also understand each other.
Absolutely.
You don't want to judge a book by its cover. We want to be able to really kind of get this understanding of one another. So maybe there'll be less wars. Maybe there'll be less, instances in the world that we're seeing today.
Angelina, that's such a good point. I mean, if you really get to know somebody and know their story, it's really hard to not find something good in them.
Right. My mother used to always say, don't judge anyone, based on what they look like, how they speak, how they talk, what they wear. Try to find the good in everyone. And when you're a teenager, you're like, yeah, whatever. But I've really grown to understand exactly what you meant. But it's been such a pleasure to speak with you today, Dr. Perry.
Thank you
for writing this book. Please, your knowledge, your expertise, it's what's needed in the world today. And it really kind of brings home, like I said, don't judge a book by its cover. You never know what somebody's going through.
Absolutely. Thank you, Angelina.
It was good speaking with you.
My pleasure.
If you haven't already done so, please go pick up his book today, What Happened to You, written by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. It'll help you put things into perspective by helping you understand how childhood trauma affects the brain, which in turn affects our responses and which can ultimately affect our overall health. I think it's good to get a grip of this scientifically, as to be able to see ourselves and our personal development as something that is capable of change. Thanks for listening, and until next time, be well and live in gratitude.